Raising America. We spoke with Stephanie Murray this week. She is the author of The Parental Happiness Fallacy. She said she was inspired to write this piece after a Pew Research study said that lower income parents seem to be enjoying life a little bit more than those who had an higher income. But there are a ton of nuances to this story. She broke it all down for us. We want to hear from you. What do you think? Does money buy you happiness? Stephanie, the reason I reached out to you, and we've been going back and forth for a couple weeks now, is an article that you published, and we'll be able to pop it up on screen. It's, if I'm not mistaken, it's the parent fallacy. Is that right? Is that the article that? Did I
Yeah,
say
like parental happiness fallacy. Yeah, I think that's what they
that?
went with. Mhm.
Missing a couple words there. And so the headline caught my attention because I thought to myself, wait, I'm a happy parent, right? Aren't we all happy parents? And I emailed you that night, and I'm so glad that you agreed to come on because there were a lot of nuances.
Oh gosh. So probably well, it was the without jumping straight into the research and overwhelming people, but there was this big Pew survey that came out a couple of years ago that caused a big sort of buzz, I would say. And people sort of did kind of what you're talking about, where they sort of zeroed in on certain data points from that. And I am a journalist who writes frequently about, I would say, I don't think that I try not to be like overly negative about parenthood, but I do, and I have written quite a bit about like ways that we can help parents in America, right? We're a little bit behind on that in some areas, right? And so sometimes I would actually get from other people, they would sort of pull certain data points from that Pew survey and say, well, look, low income people, they enjoy parenthood more than high income people, for example. So what are you talking about? This clearly has nothing to do with sort of resources, and resources aren't going to help you like giving people childcare or parental leave or money, right? That's not going to help because look, it's all the rich moms who are really miserable. And I was sort of like, okay, hang on. The survey is like much broader than that. There's a lot of nuance to it. And as I follow research sort of on I literally have a Substack called Family Stuff where I follow research on family related things. So I do follow research on parental well-being and the things that shape it. And over time, increasingly, as I was looking at this body of research, I was like, this is really complicated. There's a lot of research that kind of contradicts this narrative that is just, parental misery is purely this, like, as you said, white upper middle class phenomenon, right? But there is some research where you can kind of see that, yeah, it does kind of seem like, depending on how you measure it and how you make the comparison, it does kind of look that way, right? And so I just wanted to, I don't know, kind of like dig into it and see what the real story was. And I think the real story is that it's extremely complicated.
It is. Okay. And I was actually, and I think it was yesterday, I was downloading different NIH studies that were 40 pages long. And I thought I really need to get Stephanie on this call because I can't. So let me make some blanket statements, really blanket statements, and have your reaction. I'm going to make a blanket statement to you and say, we went through this revolution, we had this Me Too movement, women are earning more, still not as much as their counterparts on the male side, but women are earning more. They're sneaking their way into high level positions. We're seeing them as politicians. In fact, this show, we're interviewing the first female governor of New York next week. So all of these, the chips are lining up for women to have it all. They finally have it all, and they're the unhappiest they've ever been. What would you say to that?
Oh gosh.
It's a
I
loaded one, right?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say that that is true. I don't know that I would say that that is true. Now, I don't I mean, if you're talking about, the piece was about sort of parental happiness, right? So if we're talking about women more broadly, I'm not familiar with sort of like trends in life satisfaction among
Okay, so
women
I'll rephrase it for moms. Moms.
for
Let's
moms.
rephrase it. Yeah.
Um I okay, yeah, I would push back on that because I don't I mean, what we've seen, so there's a couple different ways that you could answer that question, right? You could look at historically, right, there used to be one data point that sort of goes against what you're saying is that it used to be that there was a parental happiness gap where parents were actually sort of like less happy than their non-parent counterparts. That gap actually appears to have closed over time. Now, that doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it does sort of run against this narrative that, like, you know, the current moment is particularly, you know, terrible or something like that, right? You know, it could be that non-parents are sort of, it could be that who is having kids is shifting. It could be that non-parents are sort of struggling in certain ways that we're not capturing, right? But, you know, the notion that, you know, parents are uniquely miserable at this moment in time, I don't think actually kind of like holds up.
Okay.
I do think that there is some research where it really, it kind of depends on how you're asking the question, I would say, because if you're just asking which parents are the happiest, right? Who are the happiest moms, and you're looking at socioeconomic status, pretty much you have to say it's the richer ones, the ones who are more likely to be working, the highly educated ones, the ones who have the most resources. You know, the notion that, you know, even that Pew survey found that even though, yes, lower income parents were more likely to report finding parenthood enjoyable all or most of the time, right? They also reported the highest levels of stress, right? So um, there's a lot that makes me think, yep, generally speaking, people with more resources, moms with more resources, you know, are happier. That's pretty incontrovertible. There's this kind of separate question though of how how does happiness, I mean, how does parenthood affect your well-being? And there, I think that there is some research where you could kind of look at it and make the case that, like, yeah, maybe these sort of upper middle class moms who have a lot of education, they're more likely to be working, um, have a certain layer of stress, right? That maybe lower educated parents don't. Um, and I mean, I don't know if you want me to stop there, but like there are ways to make sense of it, I would say.
Yeah.
Like I think that there are explanations that make it seem less counterintuitive, if that makes
So
sense.
what is it? So, and also, where is the line? And there was a piece in the article, and of course these are, correct me if I'm wrong, just like you did on the first one, because I'm learning as I go with some of this research that you presented. Is that, so what is the distinction? Is it college educated? Is it, you know, are you defined as highly educated if you have a master's degree, or, you know, you're a doctor, a PhD, an MD, whatever? And then also, is it, because the lower income and the less educated, they're still working, right? And if I'm not mistaken, you just said they're probably more likely to work in a hospitality style job.
Yes.
But there are differences in happiness descriptions, I guess. Would that make sense? There's in fulfillment and happiness in being a parent with those two groups, right?
Yeah, I mean, really, yeah, oh my gosh, this is honestly so complicated. So to answer your first question, there's different ways of kind of uh, looking at socioeconomic status and sort of dividing moms up in that respect. Sometimes the best you can do is just sort of to look at their education level. And so they would be looking at, I think typically it's like less than a high school degree, has a high school degree, some college, a bachelor's degree, or sort of a bachelor's degree plus,
Mhm.
right? So now, and then others ones actually do manage to look at whether or not the mom has a partner or how much income they actually have. I think that's just harder to do. It seems to me that a lot of people have trouble getting access to the income data. And so they use education almost as a little bit of a proxy, which does kind of work. Like you know, highly educated moms are more likely to have a higher household income, right? And so there is a correlation there between education level and income. So there's that. But then whether or not, I mean, it really is true that whether or not moms, like highly educated high income moms, look better off kind of depends on the kind of data that you're using, the measurement that you're using, and who you're comparing them to, right? So if you're just comparing them to other moms, like if you let's take I'll just it honestly probably makes the most sense to just use specific data points.
Okay.
The Institute for Family Studies, they shared some data with me that basically looked at how people answer the question, you know, how, like, are you satisfied with your life, right? And they found that when you look at moms of different household income levels, right? And you take the share that are saying that they are, I think they said like completely or mostly or completely satisfied with their lives. That the chances of somebody saying that they are satisfied with their lives rises with their household income, right? So it's just kind of that is a very clear data point of sort of like if you had to guess whether two moms are satisfied with their lives, the higher income one, the one with the higher income is more likely to be. That's basically what that tells us. And that's pretty consistent with what the research like Jennifer Glass, she's a researcher who studies parental well-being, and she told me the exact same thing. Basically, money helps parents money seems to correlate with parents being more satisfied with their lives.
So for the first time, it's true. Money buys you happiness.
I mean, it kind of is true. Like they
Okay.
are, you know, they tend to be in circumstances where that's how they answer the question. They're satisfied with their lives. So richer people are they're like there is a little bit of truth if you're looking at the actual data on life satisfaction that income correlates with being more satisfied with your life. And that's true for parents too. Basically, that's what that's telling us. But then she was like, yeah, but okay, if you're asking a separate question of like, um, you know, how is your well-being impacted when you become a parent, right? You might that's kind of complicated and that makes sense because it's sort of like if you are somebody who has a pretty cushy life, right? If you have a lot of money, right? And then suddenly you're responsible for a child, you know, 24 hours a day and you know the alternative to you, right, is you know, maybe compared to your alternative, that actually feels like maybe a step down, right? Like, or maybe I don't want to say a step down because it does seem like people no matter what find a lot of meaning in parenthood, right? But it might feel compared to your alternative way of living, which might feel pretty cushy, like very hard by comparison. And that trade-off is going to look very different for somebody who is maybe working who has not who's struggling to get by, right? They're working a job that does not give them a lot of meaning. Their life does not feel cushy. It feels very hard. You know, taking care of a child might genuinely feel better, right? You know, like I will fully admit that my job writing, sitting down at a computer, right, and sort of getting to read things and listening to people, interviewing people. I interview people all the time, right? That does feel easier to me than, you know, spending a full day with a toddler. I'm not
Accurate.
I've spent a lot of days with toddlers and don't regret that in any way. I It's deeply important to me to sort of like, you know, have time with my children. But, you know, if we're just comparing those two things, one of them feels a bit more stressful and grating. I get a lot more frustrated on a long day with a toddler than I do, you know, interviewing people about parental happiness, right? Like that feels mostly pretty pleasant. Th- If I was working a different job, right? Maybe I would feel very differently. Like if I was working in the service sector and you know, I waited tables for a really long time and, you know, having people constantly like demanding things of you and running around or feeling very disrespected at work or whatever it is, right? That's a very different comparison that you're making. So I think that's what um, I think you have to take that into account. You know, like the how somebody feels, how parenthood feels relative to the other ways that you might be spending your time is going to be a very different question for people of different with different work circumstances, with different strains in their life. Does that make sense?
That was one of the pieces that I took away was that, and you're right. I just like you, I'm a parent of three, and I choose to spend time with them often, and I love being with them. I will say anecdotally to other moms, if they are stay-at-home moms, in my opinion, they have it harder because I have this outlet of saying I'm a working mom, therefore it's somehow justified for me to hire someone to help me with some of the mundane tasks. So as opposed to me doing those mundane tasks, I get to do my job,
Yeah.
which I find easier than being a full, because I've done both. I've been a stay-at-home mom, I've been a full-time working mom, I've been a part-time working mom. So over the course of my role as a parent so far, I've done it all. And I would say the very, very hardest is being the stay-at-home mom.
Yeah.
So that's why your article caught my attention. And when I tried to understand, you mentioned Jennifer Glass, and I tried to go through one of her 40-page studies. And I was like, I really need Stephanie. These words are way too big. I have to use the Google machine, and I need Stephanie to help me out. Because there were parts of Stephanie's studies that I felt you were talking to other people who would contradict her in certain
Mhm.
aspects.
Mhm.
Because in one of it, she said, empty nesters really report the same happiness level as those who, and I could be wrong here because there were so many studies that I read as people who never had children. But then at
Mm.
the same time, then they have the benefit and the well-being of those relationships with those adult children, which they find satisfaction from.
Sure.
So is it almost something that can't be measured, or are there really these measurable factors? Because like you said, if you work in the service industry, that's not getting a break from your kids. So in a part of your piece, you would say that that mom who maybe is a waitress doesn't get the chance to do an interview like this that you and I are doing, that we find interesting and it's
Mhm.
stimulating part of our brain. She doesn't get a break at all. She's waiting tables and then she's going home to kids who also need to eat.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't yeah, I I'm just so I know it's going to sound like I'm almost contradicting myself here. I am part of my uh you know motivation in sort of really looking into this is that there's something to me when people first pulled out, like, reacted to the Pew survey and were saying, look, low income people, they're loving parenthood, right? There was a little bit too much, the fact that everybody was overlooking the part of the study that said they also are much more likely to say that they find parenthood stressful all or most of the time than higher income people. And the fact that, for example, another data point from that survey, the majority of parents said they found parenthood harder than they expected, right? So we've got three very confusing, very different data points, right? On the one hand, low income parents seem to find it really enjoyable, more enjoyable than higher income parents. On the other hand, they find it more stressful, right? On the other hand, everybody seems to find it difficult, right? I think when you take that all together, you get a sense of, like, okay, uh, parenthood is maybe a sensitive topic. People have complicated views on it. It can be hard to admit that it's hard, right? It can be, like, I think, it's when I spoke to Jennifer Glass, a while ago, actually, it was not even for this piece. She was saying that, like, you do, um when you ask somebody how stressed they are, right? How stressed they are without mentioning their kids, right? You'll get one answer. When you mention the kids, it becomes very sort of sensitive, right? I'm probably messing that up a little bit, but she was basically saying, like, when you actually mention people's kids, then the question becomes kind of loaded in a way that probably runs in multiple different directions, right? So anyway, that's a long way of saying that I am a little skeptical. I What motivated the piece partially was some skepticism of the idea that, like, well, yeah, it's just like, high income parents are just miserable and low income parents are just having the time of their lives, because I do think, as you said, that they are they are frequently under very precarious, circumstances where they're really not getting breaks. At the same time, I will say that if we want to take the other view of sort of like, okay, are there, um, if we look at the data, there's like some studies that do show that, um, like if you now I want to be careful here because though we need to be clear about what they're measuring. Typically the studies that I'm about to talk about are based on people actually sort of the American Time Use Survey basically asks people to walk them through the day before and then asks them like how happy they felt while they were doing the things that they were doing, right? So you get this very clear, detailed picture of like, oh, you were bathing your child at that time. How did you feel? How meaningful did that feel? How happy did that feel? How sad did you feel? How tired did you feel? Right? And so you can, researchers have basically used that data in order to sort of figure out, well, which parents are the most stressed and how do they feel while caring for their kids compared to how they feel during the rest of the day, and how do parents of different education levels feel compared to non-parents, right, like throughout the day, right? And in that data, I would say that you do see that, for one thing, you see that parents in general tend to get more happiness throughout their sort of day, but also more stress. So they sort of say, parenthood comes with like a mixed bag of emotions, generally speaking. But then when you burrow into sort of education levels, you see that it's sort of mostly only a mixed bag of emotions for highly educated parents, right? And specifically highly educated moms. So they're the ones who are actually sort of getting a stress boost almost compared to non-parents of highly educated non-parents, and compared to um uh sort of like how they feel throughout the rest of their day, if that makes sense. And so, okay, why is it that when you ask people how they're kind of feeling about when they're reading to their kids or bathing their children, you get this interesting effect where it's actually the highly educated moms who are feeling stressed? There are reasons why that might make sense. Highly educated moms do tend to sort of run in circles where the pressure, the expectations for what sort of investments they're supposed to be making in their kids are higher, right? That is one. There are different norms by class. That's just sort of a thing, right? When it comes to parenthood, also, they have they tend to live further away from family. That's my situation, right? Like you, I found stay-at-home parenthood very, very difficult. In fact, one thing that I'm basically always encouraging I think stay-at-home mothers, we should destigmatize them getting help with childcare, because I think that it can be very, very difficult to have that much responsibility for caring for your kids. But one reason maybe that I found it particularly difficult is that I don't live anywhere near my family, right? And so I didn't have sort of supports that people, living far away from home there's a class stratification of that, right? So higher educated people, higher income people, they are much more likely to live far away from family. And so maybe they're losing out on some of the help from grandmas or whatever it is, in order to help with child rearing. And maybe that has an impact on the stress they feel while caring for their kids. Also, and then we basically already said this, they're just like the alternative for somebody, everybody's alternatives are different. Like the trade-offs for how you might otherwise be spending that time with your kid are going to be different for somebody who is very wealthy than they are for somebody who is not, right? And so, this also, I will say, like when you look at people's moms' ideal work arrangements, you can see that highly educated moms, right, they are the ones who want maybe to have a lot of, I will say, okay, it's kind of interesting because a lot of moms want to work part-time. That's actually pretty common. But more highly educated moms tend to want to work more, if that makes sense, than moms with less education. And that probably has to do with the fact that the types of work that are available to them are much different than moms who are lower down the socioeconomic spectrum, right? I think that's just sort of reasonable, right? If you're, like I said, if the alternative for me is getting to do this creative work, writing, writing can be extremely frustrating, but it's not frustrating in the way working on a factory floor is, right? It's actually quite sedentary, and I get to read interesting things and I get to talk to interesting people. So when that's your alternative, right? Yeah, okay, you can see how somebody would find that a little bit harder to give up in order to care for kids than a situation where you're working in the hospitality or service sector and you're getting mistreated on a regular basis. I don't want to like make assumptions, but service sector work can be very, very hard and taxing and stressful, and people can disrespect you, right? So yeah, so we just have to keep that in mind. The trade-offs to parenthood to people are very different.
I can't help when I'm listening to you. I'm gathering two things, and I also want to tread lightly because I don't want my question to sound ignorant, quite frankly, or judgmental. But for moms who are working, like you said, in the service industry or hospitality, are looking to make ends meet, and so when they get home, just being with their kids, they might not worry about things like, I don't care if you go to piano, we can't afford it anyways. I don't care if you're in little league or take baseball lessons because I can't take time off work to get you there. So on the flip side, and again, I say this with the utmost sensitivity because I'm very grateful that I have the flexibility to have flexible hours and take my son or daughter to baseball or t-ball or lacrosse, whatever it is. But the fact of the matter is, it's so competitive that my kids are involved in all of these things. They are
Mhm.
overcommitted because even for them to play on like a school team when they get older, they have to already be playing. This is not the 80s and 90s. They have to be
Mhm.
talented at whatever they choose to do because that is how competitive is for them to play sports as they get older and older. So what I'm asking you in a very convoluted way is, when you look at this class of parents that might be more educated and they might have a higher income, is that they do feel pressure because they're in this hamster wheel of competition. So is their happiness perhaps lower because they have higher expectations? Because someone who says, I can't afford piano anyways, that's just off the plate because they're trying to make ends meet. So when they're with their kids, they're like, I'm just going to live in the moment. Here's your bike. So
Yes.
could that be, is that part of your research? Is that you've seen that?
I think I think what you just said is probably might help to explain why again, I wouldn't say that like, oh, that yep, these higher income moms are just miserable and they're less happy. I just don't think that's what the data shows. But the fact that they seem to sort of feel this sort of relative stress, they seem to have higher levels of stress sort of in time with their kids relative to how else they could be spending their time. And I think that it is very likely to me that that is related. Now, I have seen some research showing that at this point, even like low income parents are kind of aware of this sort of intensive parenting stuff. Like they know that everybody else is signing up their kids for, so they're starting to feel maybe some of the pressure too. They want their kids to do these things. They just can't, right? They can't afford them or whatever it is. But I do think I still think it's probably the case that your social circle is going to determine what you feel like you need, with the sort of investments that you need to make in your kid. And so if you're in a social circle where it's kind of like, well, yeah, everybody wants their kids to take piano lessons, but we can't afford it, right? Like maybe you don't feel the same level of like, gotta get, right? If you're in this competitive environment where, as you say, it's like the only way your kid is playing soccer at 12 is if they were playing soccer at 4, right? And they're like really, they're getting in on the ladder really quickly. I think that that kind of social pressure, I mean, to sort of like, I don't know. To me, that makes a lot of sense to me, that that would lead you to almost not. It's almost sad, like not be able to enjoy the time with your kids because every moment is something where there's this question of like, well, am I keeping up? Right? I think it makes a lot of sense that that would contribute to this kind of additional stress that we sometimes see among higher income parents, or more highly educated and probably more high income parents. I think, one of the researchers that I spoke to, I think she put it really well. She basically was like, when you, she was like, it's sort of a more money, more problems type thing, because the more money you have, the more resources you have, the more people expect you to sort of leverage those resources on behalf of your children, right? It would, I think most of us would sort of be like, oh, this person who has all the money in the world, but they're, I don't know, like they don't care at all about, right? Like they make no attempt to sort of like make sure their kids are learning to read properly or something, to intentionally kind of like do nothing to invest in your children when you have the ability to do so, does kind of raise eyebrows. It's sort of like, of course, hey, you're benefiting from this wealth, you should invest it in your children, right? There's I It's almost intuitive that is what would occur. But then if everybody around you is doing that, then it can just lead to a whole bunch of like competitive pressure, that is unfortunately very stressful. And so I think there is, um yeah, basically I'm saying yes. I think that that can be a real factor in kind of contributing to be, because like sometimes I will not lie to you, I don't even think I'm in that. I live in the UK, and the particular environment that I'm in, I don't actually feel that, right? So sometimes when I speak to people who are in kind of more uniformly upper middle class, like in a more uppity environment, I'm like, oh, that is not an expectation that I feel, right? Like I don't really feel the expectation to have my kids in activities every day. And that's because I really don't think that most people attending my kids' school could do that, right? It just wouldn't happen. And I think um uh I do think competitive parenting is a little bit more extreme. It definitely exists in the UK, but I do think it's more extreme in the US in certain circles. So I don't know.
I know, and I had a friend say to me, because we have pressure, which is nuanced to this conversation, but we have pressure to, and two of our kids are boys, and they want them in year round baseball. There have been
Mhm.
conversations. It could be also the fact that my husband played Major League Baseball for a decade and a half, but
Oh wow.
I, I had another mother say year-round baseball destroyed our version of a nuclear family. We
Mm.
don't have dinner together. We revolve around practices and tournaments. And there's no pressure on our sons to play Major League Baseball, and there's no pressure on our sons to play year-round baseball. It's a pressure that we do. Well, they're almost flabbergasted that they're not, and I have to remind them that the 5-year-old is still trying to figure out personal hygiene. So we're gonna
Right.
get that down first. Maybe we're gonna learn how to fill up a water bottle and do
Yeah.
things like open and close doors. I don't know. Maybe just very very brush teeth. Let's master that.
Yeah.
So when I also want to dig in before I let you go to the conversation, because
Mm.
yes, of course, we focus on parents, but a lot of the studies, which you said, is not just like the moms or the dads, it's the parents versus non-parents. And
Yes. Mhm.
when I sometimes I'll read all of this data and I'll say, how can you really compare it if you've never been a parent? So when you
Mhm.
have non-parents say, I just have a higher quality life. I experience more happiness. I experience more freedom. But you can't compare it to being a parent because you haven't adopted, or you haven't given birth, or you haven't had a child via a surrogate. You just haven't been a parent. So how can you say, and I guess maybe I'm a little defensive because, I fought really hard. I did all the things to have my children. I ran through the gamut. So it's hard for me to understand that there is a way to compare those two things.
Sure. Now, I mean, okay, see, that's an interesting question, and I don't even think that we have um I'm not even sure that that is something that like can be dealt with necessarily. I mean, some of the things, some I will say that some of the research that kind of looks at comparing parents to non-parents, it's not like they're saying, "Hey, are you happy at like not having children?" Right? That's not how they're asking the question. They're just sort of asking people how satisfied they are with their lives, and then comparing the sort of typical answer or the average answer among non-parents to the typical parent response, right? But I see what you're saying, where it's sort of like, well, how do you know? Um, I mean, all I'll say is that like the I think that I think that there is I would not say that there is like some sort of overwhelming evidence that parents are unhappy. I think that there's some data that suggests that as a group they used to be sort of overall more likely to report lower life satisfaction. I think that there's some a very interesting study recently came out of Europe where I liked it because they basically looked at all of Europe and they were kind of comparing non-parents to parents, and they found what a pattern that makes a lot of sense to me, which is that basically everywhere parents report higher levels of meaning in their life. Like they parents, it doesn't matter, poor parents, rich parents, parents in, like Budapest, parents in, Norway, wherever, it doesn't matter. Parenthood is associated with greater meaning in life, right? Life satisfaction, that was where it was kind of mixed. It seemed to depend on, okay, do you have how, you know, mothers seem to actually take a little bit of a penalty on life satisfaction, broadly, right? But even that, it varied by where, like what country they were in, right? The moms got a little life satisfaction boost in the Nordic region, which is, I will say, famously sort of family friendly. They have a lot of like family friendly policies. So is that a coincidence? I don't know. Uh, but then in other places they had this penalty, and then also it was the low educated single moms, who they were the more likely to sort of have lower life satisfaction than parents, right? But what does that tell us? I mean, to me that makes a lot of sense. Even when I was really struggling with stay-at-home motherhood, right, that we talked about, there have been times in my life where I was finding parenthood really, really stressful, and even then I would have said, but my kids mean so much to me. You know what I'm saying? It would have meant so much to me. So to me, that pattern that study found is kind of speaks to what you're saying, where people just find parenthood meaningful. It is a meaning making thing in their life. It is something that people find gratifying in sort of like this deep and lasting way that has less to do with how they feel on a moment to moment basis and more to do with like, I'm doing something important with my life. I'm building a bond that will withstand this stressful day, right? You know what I'm saying? Like it's about sort of the future. It's a very, like, as opposed to, and parents feel that way even if the day-to-day stresses of their life are high, so I think honestly that might be one of the this whole piece was sort of like, well, which parents are the most stressed, which parents are the most miserable, who's the happiest, who's enjoying parenthood the most. I think stepping back from all that, because we can see it's a super complicated question. I think it's pretty clear that all parents derive, like, that parenthood is meaningful for everyone, regardless of circumstance, right? So all these people, the poor moms, the rich moms, the highly educated moms, the low educated moms, they are all deriving a lot of meaning from their life as a parent. And that itself is sort of worth, taking into consideration,
The
Um,
price of admission, if you will. Okay,
yeah.
so your biggest takeaways, what did you find most surprising? And you mentioned some of the Nordic countries. Yes, I know that they have some very family friendly policies. You look at, over here, states like New Mexico are the first state to provide, universal childcare, and that started actually, I think it was about 10 days ago, November 1st. So, depending on when you're listening to this, November 1st. Now, so tell me, rapid fire, what did you learn? Who is the happiest and who is the unhappiest?
Sorry, I still think that richer moms, like, that they, if we're just talking about who has the highest life satisfaction, richer people, including richer moms, they report higher levels of life satisfaction. So, I mean, I just think that that is something we have to accept. There's no way to sort of spin this in a way where it's like, oh, actually, the poorer
Right.
people are the most happy, so we should all be poor. That's just, I don't see that. Um, but I do think that I will say that what surprised me most was that I do think that there is, there is more evidence to suggest that, like, you know, how you feel on a given day is dependent, how you feel about your time with your kids on a given day. Um, it's going to be affected by your options and what other and your specific circumstances and what else you could be doing with your time. And so there is some evidence that, like, hey, like, people who, even if for people who don't have a lot or they have really stressful jobs, spending time with even a cranky toddler, right, is feels, like the better option, right? So,
Mhm.
I think that there's something to that, like, basically, we're all weighing, we're all making trade-offs, and those trade-offs look different for different people, and we should keep that in mind. But then also, I think, honestly, one of my biggest takeaways from this is exactly what we just said. How stressful is parenthood for people? You get different answers depending on how you look at it, but it's meaningful for everybody. That seems to be the takeaway for me. I think that yeah, I think that people find parenthood meaningful. I think that whether or not it's stressful is a separate
Right.
question.
I was gonna say maybe we should just put them in different buckets. That was sort of my takeaway, is that some of the data, it feels as if it's contradictory, but then you think about it and you're like, oh no, because you can be two things at the same time. You can be stressed out and exhausted and happy at the same time. You can love your children and just hate the situation that you're in because everybody's crying and it's 6 p.m. But that doesn't take away from that fact that this bucket is still full, that you still love them. You just are two things simultaneously. So I
Mm.
loved the piece, and I went down a rabbit hole, as I mentioned, trying to, like I said, Google some of these very complicated words that I somehow missed. And when I was educated, even though I'd fall under that very highly educated bucket. And I'm grateful for your time, Stephanie. I think we'll definitely probably have you back because there'll be other times where I come across articles that have words too big for me to understand.
Oh my gosh, I would love it. I will say, sorry, I don't.
No, I love it.
Um, the other, I do think, if as long as we're talking about takeaways, the other one is, my impression is that people, it is so complicated, right? I don't even know if I made much sense in, like, rambling all these sort of different things, because about all these different things, just because it's a massively complicated body of research, and you do get what appears to be contradictory statements. But I think partially what that tells us is, well, it really depends on the specific question that you're asking. But also, I kind of think there people feel parenthood is hard to talk about. Like, it's hard. It really is a mixed bag of emotions, and people can get defensive in both directions depending on how you talk to them about it, right? If you say, people can get defensive about being like, no, it is really hard, right? Like, stop telling me this is easy, right? Or they can get, if you say, like, well, all parents are miserable, then you get really like,
I would agree.
no, it's not miserable, I love my kids, right? You know what I'm saying? So I think that I honestly think one of my main takeaways from the reporting I did for this piece and reporting on parenthood well-being in general is just that people, it's a sensitive topic, and people, um depending on how you approach it, you can get very different responses from people. You know, everybody loves their kids. Nobody likes, saying, like, nobody likes feeling like, oh, it sounds like I don't enjoy my children or something like that. But then also people take pride in the fact that parenthood is hard, right? And so they don't want to be like, they don't like the idea of it being, oh, just this easy thing, because then it feels like their work is being really devalued. So you get kind of conflicting, it's really difficult, it's really enjoyable, it's the greatest thing in the world, but also, oh my gosh, I've never been so tired, right? It really is kind of a mixed bag of emotions and a sensitive topic. So that would be my other takeaway.
I would agree. Yeah, you never know what talents or anger someone is capable of unless you make like a passive aggressive comment, or if you see like your kids on a sports team. We were just at the championship for the 5-year-old, and another dad dropped the F bomb, and then we're yelling at him, and I'm thinking to myself, if you at the end of the day, in the car ride home, I said, at the end of the day, we all, whether we acted like fools or not, we just love these people so much
Yeah.
that, I mean, if I drop the F bomb in front of my kids, I'm like, oh, my bad. But if somebody else does, I'm like, you just destroyed the innocence of my 5-year-old, and we have to leave, and you should be embarrassed, when really it's just, we just want the best for them. And it's inexplicable how much we love them that we act irrationally. So I think you're right. That would be my reaction when I hear you say that. It's almost like you lose all self control
Yeah.
because you just love these people. You can't help it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a sensitive topic. People are sensitive about parenthood. It's just, I don't think we're ever, I honestly think that's why we will never get like a really clear picture of how people feel about it, because it's so sensitive, and it's so, and yeah, bound up with, people love their kids.
People love their kids. Well, Stephanie, I love talking to you. So definitely, hey, keep us in mind in the future. And thank you for joining us. I appreciate you over in the UK.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me.